It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Philips 288E2UAE. The OSD is controlled by a joystick at the rear of the monitor towards the right side as we view it from in front. If you twiddle the joystick up, you can change the input used by the monitor. Press it down, you can change the volume of the integrated speakers on the UAE model, or the 3.5mm jack if that's what you're using on the UAE model, or indeed the E2E model, which lacks the integrated speakers. If you press the joystick left, you can change the Smart Image Game preset of the monitor. So various presets here, they just change a range of things in the OSD. The FPS mode, for example, gives everything a cool look, cool tinted, so a high white point. It also over sharpens things. So you can see the sharpness there is set to 70 rather than the default of 50. Sets it to 100 brightness so it's relatively bright. Does various things. You can just adjust these yourself, so there's nothing particularly interesting about most of these presets. Racing makes various other adjustments, RTS the same. Gamer 1 and Gamer 2, so you can just sort of customize them how you want. Low blue mode, low blue light settings of the monitor. The various different settings associated with this under low blue mode in the OSD, in the main menu system. So if that is enabled, you can have it set to 1, which is the weakest effect, 2, which is stronger, 3, stronger again, and 4, stronger again. I actually prefer an alternative low blue light setting on this monitor, setting the colour temperature to 5000K, and I'll come on to that shortly. But the reason for that is that the low blue mode here, it maintains a strong green channel, so it gives things a kind of greenish yellow tint, and I like to avoid that with a setting which reduces the green channel a bit more. But I wouldn't say the green tint on this one's extreme. I do explore this in the written review a bit, but it is there, and I think the balance is a bit better using the 5000K mode. But these are certainly effective. They reduce the blue light output, and that's particularly important in the hours leading up to sleep when you want to be relaxing rather than having your body in a high state of alertness. Next, there's Easy Read, and that makes everything grayscale, so that does have a sort of special function if you like. Another setting with a special function is Smart Uniformity. This is a uniformity compensation setting which is explored in the written review as well. So that's designed to even out brightness and colour temperature at various points of the screen. And you do lose some contrast in doing so. Again, this is explored in the written review. And then there's the default setting, which is off. And again, you can just use Gamer 1 or Gamer 2, or in fact any of the other presets. It's just that Gamer 1 and Gamer 2 have a base which is more similar to off, so I use these for my test settings. And more specifically, what I do is I use Gamer 1 for my test settings, and Gamer 2 for my evening viewing, my relaxing evening viewing, so that has my low blue light settings active. But you can use them however you want. If you press the joystick right, you then get into the main menu system, the main OSD. So first up there's Game Setting. Smart Response, you can set that to off, fast, faster or fastest. This is the pixel overdrive setting. I find fast optimal as explored in the review. Next up there's Smart Frame. This isn't available in all presets. I think it's available in most of them, certainly in the Gamer 1 and Gamer 2 presets for example. And if you enable that, it just puts a little box on the screen. You can change the position of that box, but what it allows you to do is alter the digital brightness and the contrast that box versus the rest of the screen. So remember, it's a digital brightness control. You can't change the backlight brightness just for that section. This screen doesn't have local dimming or anything like that, so it isn't the same as the brightness control on the monitor, but it lets you highlight a particular section of the screen for whatever reason. Or if you set the size to 7, you can actually have it so it is making changes to the entire image. So if you really like to tweak things, I wouldn't recommend doing this, there's no need to on this monitor, but if you do like to really tweak things, then you can set the Smart Frame size to 7 and make various adjustments there for the whole screen. Next you've got Low Blue Mode, which I've been through already. Input, that just does what it says on the tin, allows you to change the input, HDMI 2 display port, and you can have it so you manually select the input and it won't automatically scan for sources and select the input for you, or if you prefer, it can automatically select the inputs for you. There's Picture, so that allows you to change the Smart Image presets of the monitor, or Smart Image Game. You can change the brightness and the contrast, and indeed the sharpness. The sharpness is in increments of 10. The default of 50 is optimal, but people might want to adjust this according to preferences, and particularly if you're running a non-native resolution, such as Full HD or WQHD, then you might want to increase the sharpness a bit here. There's then Smart Contrast. That's a dynamic contrast setting which is explored in the written review. Gamma, 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, 2.4 and 2.6. Don't necessarily assume that the values given here are going to be exactly what the gamma is. It does depend on calibration, but my monitor was certainly good to go with the default 2.2 mode, and you can see that is all explored in the calibration section of the written review. Pixel orbiting. What this does is it just periodically nudges pixels, or the image I should say, by 1 pixel in one direction and then pretty much immediately back to where it was. It does this, I'm not really sure exactly, maybe every couple of hours. I've actually just left this on, or I believe it was on by default. I would not really fuss about this setting, leave it on unless you're finding that the image keeps nudging and it's annoying you, but honestly I haven't even noticed it doing that. This is just something which Philips monitors always seem to have by default. It's designed to reduce the chances of image retention. I haven't had any such issues on this model anyway, and as I said, it's something that Philips monitors always have, so don't worry about that. Next is overscan and DPS. So overscan is for older systems, and you'd have to have it connected and using that kind of signal where that's relevant for that to be something you can enable. And DPS, I think it's dynamic power saver or dynamic power saving or something like that. I mentioned this briefly in the written review, but you can't always enable this. It depends on the preset you're using. So if I turn Smart Image off or Smart Image Game off, I think this will be something I can select. All this does is it means that when there's predominantly dark content on the screen, it will dim slightly. So it's sort of like a very mild dynamic contrast setting. It's just designed to slightly reduce power consumption. For the purpose of stability in my testing, I have this disabled. I believe it's actually enabled by default, but as I mentioned, depending on the preset you're using, it's not going to be something you can use anyway. You then got PIP, picture-in-picture, / P by P, picture-by-picture. So with PIP, you have one section of the screen which will be your secondary source, and the rest of the screen your main source. I've only got one thing connected, so it's just duplicating the source here. But it's got a little section there showing what would be my secondary source and my primary source for the rest of the screen. You can select the inputs used for your primary source. You can change the size of the PIP box so it's small as it is now, middle or large. You can change its position so it's top right, top left, bottom right or bottom left, depending on your preferences. And swap, which will swap the primary and secondary sources. If you go on PIP / P by P mode, you can change it to P by P instead of PIP. So picture by picture now. So you've got your primary and secondary source next to each other. It's just 2-way P by P on this one, not 3-way, not 4-way. And I think it gave a little message there saying that if you want to use the full screen, you'd set the resolution to whatever it was it said, but it's a bit of a strange resolution. So it is paying attention to the aspect ratio. It's not trying to stretch things and make things look really weird by filling up the space. So it will give you a black border instead. You can select your inputs used. In my case, I've only got DisplayPort connected, so that's all I can select anyway. And you can swap the primary and secondary source around. And I should also mention, in case you're freaking out a bit, yes, you can see some IPS glow and actually some backlight bleed. But that's exaggerated in this section of the video. It's really overexposing it a lot. So I'd refer to the review where the camera's exposure is more appropriately controlled, rather than freaking out about this. But it's something which varies between individual units anyway. I just thought I should mention that, as I can see from the camera's preview screen that there's a lot of this going on there and there as well, a little bit towards the top right, but to my eye it's certainly not as clear as it appears in the video. Next up you've got Smart Size. So these are the scaling settings of the monitor, and if you've got Adaptive Sync active, as I do now, I'm using NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode. This is grayed out, so I'm going to have to disable Adaptive Sync. And there's no control for that in the monitor, by the way, it's just something you'd have to do in the graphics driver. So I'm just going to disable G-Sync compatible mode. And now you can see the smart size options are available. So the default panel size 28 wide 16 by 9, that uses all pixels regardless of the resolution you're using. It'll use all of the pixels of the screen, fill them up, use interpolation. That's explored in the interpolation and upscaling section of the written review. But there are various other settings here, emulation modes if you like, which will simulate different screen sizes and aspect ratios. I'm not going to go through all of these because I think it'll take quite a while. But I'll just show you 21.5 inch 16 by 9 just to give you an idea of the kind of thing it does. There's a 1:1, and if you're using the native resolution as I am now, that doesn't do anything. It's exactly the same as if you'd selected panel size 28 inch 16 by 9 using all of the pixels, and it's the native resolution, so nothing exciting is happening. However, with the full HD resolution, this is what it looks like. So the first thing you might observe is the fact that there is a large black border around the image, and in the middle you've got 1920 by 1080 pixels, completely undistorted, but obviously that's just a small section of the screen. If you select 2560 by 1440, 1440p or WQHD if you prefer, you get a bit of a bigger box because there are more pixels being used, but again there's a black border for the rest. There's then aspect as the remaining setting, and what that is supposed to do is maintain the aspect ratio of the source resolution, but as you can see this is completely messed up because I've selected a 16 by 9 resolution, or a resolution with 16 by 9 aspect ratio, and for some reason things have clearly been squashed together. This isn't what it's supposed to do. It's clearly not 16 by 9 going on there, so perhaps with some resolutions this might work better. I'm just going to, in the name of science, I'm going to select a different resolution, one that has a different aspect ratio, and see what happens here. So let's try a 16 by 10 resolution, and this again appears stretched. So I'm not entirely sure what this setting's doing. It doesn't seem to be doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing though. Just for reference, this is what that resolution 1920 by 1200 looks like with the 1:1 setting. And if you set panel size to 28 inch 16 by 9, it seems that it's using as much of the screen as possible, but it doesn't actually fill out all of the pixels. So a slight change to what I said earlier, it doesn't use all of the pixels regardless of the aspect ratio. It seems that only 16 by 9 will do that. Otherwise it will try to use as much of the screen as it can without distorting the image. And just to test that, I'm going to try 1440 by 900 and see what happens there. So that uses all of the screen, even though that's technically not a 16 by 9 resolution. So I think there was just something a little bit weird about some of these resolutions. Some of them do work as you'd expect. So this is filling out all of the screen. Some of them, it seems, has that black border. It shouldn't really have that black border, but it's just what happens. And I'm afraid I can't go through every single resolution here. It would take a long time and be extremely boring. So I'm just going to leave it there. Next, you've got audio. So this allows you to control the volume. You can mute the integrated speakers or the 3.5mm jack, depending on what you're doing and depending on which version of the monitor you've got, in fact, because you might not have integrated speakers on the E2E. And you can change the source used for the audio, either DisplayPort or HDMI. Next, you've got colour. You can change the colour temperature used by the monitor, so 6500K, 5000K, 7500, 8200, 9300 and 11500, or native. So native will just set all the colour channels to 100 apiece. So that will give you the full contrast, but won't necessarily give you particularly good colour temperature. 6500K, that's the default, and I should mention as well that on my unit these were quite close to the intended value, but that might not necessarily be the case. It really just depends on your unit and the calibration. But 5000K was that setting I was mentioning before, which is an effective low blue light setting. There's then sRGB, that's an sRGB emulation mode, which is explored in the review, so that clamps the gamut so it is close to sRGB. Something to be aware of though is that it does lock off your settings, so you can't change the colour channels because this becomes your colour channel adjustment, your colour temperature adjustment. And if you go to picture, if you try and change the brightness, it just says that it's going to change the colour temperature, so basically disable the setting if you do that. User define, that allows you to manually configure the red, green and blue colour channels. Next you've got language. You can change the language that the OSD is displayed in. OSD setup, You can change the horizontal and vertical position on the screen of the OSD. The transparency effect, you can have that on if you want. OSD timeout, so how long after the last button press before the OSD automatically disappears. If you want to get rid of it manually, just press the joystick left a few times. There's a USB setting. This is only relevant on the E2UAE model, not the E2E, because only the E2UAE actually has USB ports, but this just allows you to choose whether you want the USB ports to be active when the monitor's on standby. So if you have this set to on, it will increase your power draw, and I think it actually gives you a message on the screen every time you turn the monitor on if you've got this set to on, just to remind you of that. So they kind of really want you to disable this unless you're definitely wanting to use those ports when the monitor's switched off. The power draw difference isn't going to be massive. I haven't measured it myself, but I do know from past experience it's quite marginal. But it is still something, so if you're not going to be using those ports, you might as well have this set to USB standby mode off. Next, there's setup. So this has a resolution notification if you want a little message on the screen when you're running a non-native resolution, just to remind you of that. Reset, which will reset everything to the factory defaults. And information, which has a little bit of information about the monitor. And when it says 3840 by 2160 at 60 Hz, the at 60 Hz, the refresh rate, that does actually change if you're using adaptive sync and it's within your VRR window, variable refresh rate window. So that gives you an indication that adaptive sync is actually working. So that was the last thing in the menu. And just to round off, I'm going to look at SmartControl, Philips SmartControl. You can download this using the link given in the description of the video. This is quite basic software. It isn't something which allows you to change absolutely everything in the OSD. There are just some settings which it will allow you to change. Another thing is that it gives you this little thing up here. It can be a bit tricky to see against the background, and also because of the high pixel density, I'm not using scaling at the moment. This is a very small icon, but just to focus in a bit on this first. It has display 1 and display 2, and there are various different layouts you can choose. It's a function which allows you to snap windows to different positions on the screen easily. So I've got a couple of instances of my website open now, and if you select one of these, you'll see it has a little grid on the screen, and it'll just allow you to quickly snap the windows to those positions. With some settings of this sort, I've seen, I think it's Dell Display Manager, I'm not entirely sure, but with some of these, once you've got them into position, and you'll see actually there's a gap there. I don't know if that's just on Google Chrome or if it's a more general thing, but you can see it's not quite filling up all of the screen, so that's a little bit strange, but I know, and there's actually a little gap to the right. I'm not sure if you can see that, just to the right of the scroll bar there, there's a slight gap, so it isn't perfect. So it certainly isn't with Google Chrome anyway. And anyway, with some of these software types, when you change the layout, it will snap the window automatically or the windows automatically into position. This one doesn't seem to do that. And if you've got multiple displays connected, you can have that controlled on display 1 and also display 2. So with the SmartControl software, there's picture format, so you can select wide 4:3 or 1:1. The 3 at the bottom there are grayed out. And of course, it seems to let me select them even though I've got adaptive sync active, so it's not going to do anything anyway, and it's not going to be something you can use. And it doesn't have all of the settings, I showed you them earlier, so it just has some of them. Brightness, quite self-explanatory, but that does certainly work. It allows you to easily control the brightness of the screen. And if you press reset, it'll just reset to what was selected before. Same with contrast. You can change the resolution and the refresh rate, so this is the full list that's taken from the EDID, the Extended Display Information data of the monitor. There's then colour, so you can change the colour temperature or you can use that sRGB setting. If you go on User Define, you can manually change the red, green and blue colour channels. Black level, that's not relevant on this monitor, so you will notice actually some settings that aren't available on this monitor or on the monitor. They're still on this software. You can actually use this software to control basic things like brightness on quite a few monitors. They don't have to be Philips monitors necessarily. So just a little tip for you, if you like to be able to do that kind of thing. Display gamma, you can change the gamma. Smart image, you can change the preset. This is probably the most confusing because it actually has duplication. So for example, it has low blue mode there, but I can't click it. It has low blue mode there, but I can't click it. it has low blue mode here, and I can click it. So it's a bit weird, to be honest, the way it has lots of things that you can't actually use displayed, and it isn't always clear what's grayed out and what's not because of the way it presents it. You might be able to see on the video there's not that much distinction between what's grayed out and what isn't, and it doesn't seem to have all of the presets anyway, just some of them. There's Eco Power, so this allows you to activate a power saving function which will let your display go into standby, which is idle timer, after you have stopped using your computer for a given amount of time in minutes between 0 and 100. And you can do the same, but instead of having the monitor go into a low power state, so that's standby, it will turn off. And that's technically still a standby state, but it's active off, so it's as if you've pressed the power button. So that's really the lowest power state you'll achieve without actually turning the monitor off at the wall, so to speak. There's power off schedule, so you can have the screen turn off at various times. So if you wanted it to turn off on Monday at 8 in the morning, or perhaps Monday and Friday at 8 in the morning, or whatever it might be, you can do that. So I suppose this could be quite useful if you have a set bedtime which you're supposed to stick to, and you want a very obvious reminder that you should be off your computer. Just have the monitor switch off at that time. I'm assuming that won't be 8 in the morning for most people, but you never know. Then you've got Setup. So this collects various information from the EDID. Reset, which will reset everything to the factory defaults. Screen Rotate. This monitor doesn't actually have pivot with the included stand, but you might have it on an alternative solution with 100 by 100 millimeter VESA, and you might be able to rotate it with that. So this is relevant there. You can just change the angle of the screen. I'm not going to click one of these because then it's going to be really difficult to use the mouse and it's going to be a bit embarrassing on the video, so I'm not going to click this. Automatic, that is supposed to automatically pivot it into portrait if you've pivoted the screen. I'm not sure if that works on this one because it doesn't have pivot functionality in the stand. I'm not sure if it has the sensors to know when it's in landscape or portrait. It might have, I haven't tested it. There's also VGA, which this monitor doesn't have, so again that's something which shouldn't really be there. Audio, quite self-explanatory, allows you to change the volume or mute the integrated speakers or 3.5mm jack. And multi-monitor, it just allows you to select the monitor that you're controlling with the software. So that's really all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Philips 288E2UAE or 288E2E. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.